door to my own study slammed so hard that the framed photo of my late wife fell off the wall. I stood there, looking at the cracked glass on the floor, and I did not say a word. My daughter-in-law had just told me, in my own house, at the desk I had built with my own hands 30 years ago, that I was embarrassing and stuck in the past. She said it the way you'd say it to a child. Slow, deliberate, making sure every syllable landed. I was 63 years old. I had spent 31 years running a small but honest electrical contracting business in Kitchener, Ontario. I had put my son through university. I had paid off a mortgage. I had watched my wife Elaine lose her fight with cancer in this house, in the bedroom at the end of the hall, and I had held her hand until there was nothing left to hold. And I was embarrassing. I picked up the photo. Elaine was laughing in it, the kind of laugh she only had at the cottage, head thrown back, eyes half closed. I set it on the desk, face down so I wouldn't have to explain the cracked glass to anyone. Then I sat in my chair, the old leather one she had bought me for my 50th birthday, and I thought about the last 14 months. That was how long Colette had been living in my house. My son Owen had called me from Calgary in the spring of the year before. He and Colette were relocating. The tech start-up he'd been working for had folded, and Colette's contract in Alberta had ended. They needed a few months to land on their feet, get jobs, figure out Toronto or Kitchener or wherever the next chapter was going to be. Just a few months, Dad. You got the space. I did have the space. The house has 4 bedrooms. After Elaine, it echoed. So I said yes. What I did not fully understand at the time was that Colette had already decided the house was theirs. It happened gradually, the way water gets into a foundation. A small crack, then another, and by the time you see the damage, the whole thing has shifted. She rearranged the kitchen within the first 2 weeks. Said the layout wasn't functional. I found Elaine's good dishes, the blue willow set we had bought together at an antique market in Elora, packed in a cardboard box in the garage. Colette had replaced them with a white set from IKEA. I didn't say anything. It was just dishes. She started having her friends over on weeknights. Long dinners that went past midnight, voices carrying up through the ceiling to my bedroom. Once I came downstairs at 11:30 for a glass of water and one of her friends looked at me the way you look at someone who has wandered into the wrong room. I didn't say a word. I didn't say a word. She began referring to it as our house when she was on the phone. I heard her once standing in the back garden telling someone that the house is finally starting to feel like ours. I stood at the kitchen window for a moment, then went and watched the news. Owen worked remotely. He was busy, genuinely busy, rebuilding his career after the Calgary collapse. And I think he had learned somewhere along the way that agreeing with Colette was easier than the alternative. He loved her. I could see that, but I also watched him go quiet in rooms where she was loud. I watched him check her face before he answered my questions. He had been a confident boy. I wasn't sure where that had gone. My granddaughter Wren was born 8 months after they moved in. That changed things again. Colette took maternity leave and was home full-time, and suddenly the house that had been shifting under me was completely reoriented. She decided which rooms were which. The spare room I had kept as a home office, with my files and my old drafting table, became the nursery. I helped paint it. I was glad to. But when I asked where my files were going, she said Owen had put them in the basement, and that the drafting table had been listed on Facebook Marketplace because it was taking up space. I had done 17 years of work on that table. I retrieved it from the buyer before they picked it up. I paid them $30 for the inconvenience and brought it back to the garage. Colette did not speak to me for 4 days after that. Owen apologized on her behalf. He said she was tired. New baby, a lot of adjustment. I said I understood. But I was beginning to understand something else too. The dinner conversation that changed everything happened on a Thursday in November. Owen was in Vancouver for a client meeting. Colette and I were eating at the kitchen table. She had taken to cooking dinner, which I appreciated, even if she pointedly did not ask what I liked, and she brought up, very casually, as if she were mentioning the weather, that it might make more sense for me to transition to the basement suite. I put my fork down. "The basement," I said. "It's fully finished," she said. "You'd have your own space, your own entrance. Owen and I are going to need more room with Ren, and the main floor just makes more sense for a family." I looked at her. She was cutting her chicken into very precise pieces, not looking up. "Colette," I said, "this is my home." She looked up then. Her expression was patient in a way that was not patience at all. "We know that, obviously, but you have to admit it makes more practical sense. The basement is really nice, and you'd still be close to Ren." "I'm going to bed," I said. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my bedroom, the one I had shared with Elaine, the one where I had watched my wife take her last breath. And I stared at the ceiling, and I tried to understand what was happening to me. I was not a man who had enemies. I had never harmed anyone. I had done nothing wrong except open my door. The next morning, I called my accountant, a woman named Beverly who had handled my finances since I sold the business. I asked her to walk me through the deed on the house, the will, all of it, just to remind myself. Beverly knew me well enough not to ask questions she didn't need to ask. Everything was in order. The house was mine. The will left it to Owen, with provisions for a grandchildren's trust that Elaine and I had set up years ago. Nothing Colette could touch without Owen's signature, and nothing Owen could transfer without a lawyer involved. I felt slightly better, but only slightly. The incident with the study happened 6 weeks later. I had been on a phone call with my old business partner Jerry, who was in Winnipeg now and retired, and we had been talking for maybe 40 minutes about nothing important: hockey, his knee replacement, whether the new Tim Hortons near my place was any better than the old one. When I came out of the study, Colette was standing in the hallway. She asked me very precisely if I'd been complaining about her to people. I told her I had been talking to Jerry about hockey. She said she could tell that I had an issue with her and that I needed to deal with it directly instead of going behind her back. I told her, as calmly as I could, that I had not been speaking about her at all. She told me I was being defensive and that this was exactly the problem, that I made everything awkward and difficult, and that Owen found it stressful too, which I knew was not entirely true, but also not entirely false, because Owen found everything stressful now. That was when she said it, that I was embarrassing, that I was stuck in the past, that maybe I needed to think seriously about what kind of dynamic I wanted with my son and his family, because the way things were going, it wasn't sustainable. And then she walked away and slammed my study door behind her. I sat with that word for a long time. Sustainable, as if I were a practice to be evaluated, as if living in my own home was a privilege she was choosing to extend. That evening, after Colette had gone to bed and Owen had called to say goodnight from Vancouver, I went down to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the table in the dark for a while, just thinking. I thought about Beverly. I thought about the conversation we'd had about the will. I thought about the grandchildren's trust, and I thought about something Beverly had mentioned almost in passing, that since Elaine's passing, I had never formally updated the property to reflect a secondary registered interest, which meant that certain cohabitation agreements might technically carry weight in Ontario family law if a dispute ever arose. I called Beverly the next morning. I asked her to explain that to me again, slowly. Then I called a real estate lawyer named Mitchell, who had handled my commercial properties when I was still running the business. I hadn't spoken to him in 4 years, but he remembered me. I did not tell Owen any of this, not because I wanted to deceive him, but because I needed to understand the situation myself before I could explain it to anyone else, and because some part of me already knew that Owen, if told, would tell Colette, and Colette would move faster than I was prepared for. What I learned over the next 3 weeks changed the temperature of everything. In Ontario, a person who has cohabited in a property for more than a year and contributed to household expenses, even informally, can in certain circumstances make a claim against the property under unjust enrichment provisions. Colette had been paying a nominal amount into the household account each month, which he had framed as contributing to utilities. It was $400. It was nothing relative to the actual costs, but it was documented, and she had been documenting it carefully. Mitchell pulled the records she had submitted to a paralegal. records I had no idea she had been compiling, grocery receipts, utility payments, a written record of home improvement contributions, including the IKEA dishes, the nursery paint, a new bathroom fixture she had ordered online. She had been building a file for 8 months. She had been planning this before she ever mentioned the basement suite. I sat in Mitchell's office on a Tuesday afternoon and read through the file, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not anger exactly. Anger is hot, and this was cold. It was the feeling of finally understanding something that had been confusing you for a long time. The relief of it almost. The clarity. I told Mitchell what I wanted to do. He looked at me over his glasses for a moment, then he nodded and said, "That can be done." I spent the next 6 weeks being exactly who Colette thought I was, a quiet, slightly slow retired man who went to bed early and watched too much hockey and occasionally got in the way. I was pleasant at dinner. I admired Wren, who was starting to sit up on her own and had the most extraordinary dark eyes. I helped Owen carry in groceries one Saturday morning, and we talked about the Leafs for 20 minutes on the front step, and it felt, briefly, like it used to. I said nothing about Mitchell. I said nothing about Beverly. I said nothing about the records. What I did do was start keeping my own records. I had an old BlackBerry in a drawer. I know, but it still worked, and nobody paid any attention to it, and I began using it to document dates, conversations, incidents. I noted when Colette mentioned the basement again, which she did 3 more times over those 6 weeks, each time framed slightly differently, like someone testing different keys on a lock. I noted when she told Owen, within my earshot, that this living situation isn't healthy for anyone, including your father. I noted the evening she told me directly that she and Owen had discussed it, and that they felt a family meeting was necessary to make some decisions. That was on a Wednesday. Owen was home. He came and found me in the garage, where I was refinishing the old drafting table, and he sat on a stool and looked at his hands and said, "Dad, I think we need to talk. As a family. Colette thinks." "I do what Colette thinks," I said. "I'd like to wait until Saturday for that conversation, if you don't mind. I'm expecting someone." Owen looked up. "Who?" "An old colleague," I said. "Jerry's actually coming through from Winnipeg. I thought I'd make dinner." Owen relaxed. He liked Jerry. He'd known him since he was a boy. "Oh, sure," he said. "Yeah, Saturday's fine." That night I called Mitchell. I told him Saturday. I also called my daughter Bridget, who lives in Halifax, and who I had not fully explained any of this to, though she had sensed enough over the months to call me once a week without being asked. Bridget is sharp. She gets that from Elaine. I told her what I needed to tell her, and there was a long silence on the phone, and then she said, "Dad, how long have you been sitting on all of this?" I told her 6 weeks. She booked a flight the next morning. Saturday arrived the way important days always do, ordinary on the outside. It was cold, first week of December, the kind of dry Kitchener cold that gets into your back. I had been up since 5. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the yard fill up with pale grey light, and I thought about Elaine, which I always do when something is about to happen that she should be here for. I had made, over the course of my professional life, one absolute rule: never walk into a room where you don't control the information. I had learned it from a bad partnership in my 30s, and I had never forgotten it. Colette had spent 14 months assuming she was the one with the information. She had the file, she had the documentation, she had Owen. What she did not have was the conversation I'd had with Owen's university roommate, now a financial advisor in Waterloo, who had been approached by Colette's brother 8 months ago about investment opportunities involving my retirement property in Elora, a property I had never discussed with Colette, had never mentioned to Owen in her presence, and whose existence she should not have known about at all. She had been researching my assets. She had been doing it for nearly a year. Mitchell arrived at 4 o'clock. Bridget had come in from the airport at 2 and was upstairs with Wren, who had taken to her immediately in the way that babies sometimes do with people who are genuinely calm. Beverly arrived at 4:15, and a woman named Anita, who was a family mediator that Mitchell had worked with for years, and who had agreed to be present at my request, came at 4:30. I had set the dining room table properly, the blue willow dishes were back from the garage, I had made a roast maple-glazed carrots, the potato dish Elaine used to make for company. The house smelled like it used to. Colette came downstairs at 5, dressed for a dinner she believed was going to be Owen's old friend Jerry, at a quiet family evening. She stopped in the doorway of the dining room. She looked at the table, she looked at Beverly, she looked at Mitchell, she looked at Anita, she looked at Bridget, who was standing near the window with Wren on a hip. She did not look at me. Owen came down behind her. He saw the same things, and I watched his face move through confusion, and then something harder to name. He looked at me, and I looked back at him, and I said quietly, "Sit down, son. Nobody is here to hurt you." We sat. I did not raise my voice once during the next 2 hours. I did not need to. Mitchell walked through the property documentation, the deed, the clear title, the will, Elaine's estate provisions, the grandchildren's trust, all of it. He walked through the cohabitation file that Colette had been building, and he explained, with Beverly nodding beside him, exactly what it could and could not be used for under Ontario law, and what certain actions, specifically the approach to Owen's university roommate regarding my Elora property, would look like to a court if it ever came to that. Colette said 3 times that she didn't know what anyone was talking about. The 3rd time she said it, Anita set a printed email on the table in front of her. The email was from Colette's brother to Owen's university roommate, referencing the Elora asset and asking about timeline for transfer. Colette looked at it for a long moment. Owen looked at it for longer. "I didn't say about this," Owen said. His voice was very quiet. "I know you didn't," I said. "What happened after that is between my son and his wife, and I will not put it on display here. What I will say is that Colette left the table before dinner was finished, that Bridget stayed for 4 days, that Owen and I sat up until 2 in the morning that first night at that same kitchen table and talked in a way we hadn't talked since before Elaine died." He cried. "So did I, eventually." He said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't see it." I told him the truth, that I hadn't seen all of it either, not for a long time, that it had come on slow, and that slow things are harder to name. The following month, Colette's name was not added to any property documentation. The informal cohabitation record she had been building was reviewed by Mitchell and found insufficient to support any claim under the circumstances, particularly in light of the Elora situation. Owen and Colette entered couples counseling, which I am not going to comment on, beyond saying that I hope it helps them. Owen still lives in my house. Colette does too, for now. I am still in my bedroom, the one at the end of the hall, with the framed photo of Elaine on the desk. I had the glass replaced. We eat dinner together on Sundays. It is not warm, not yet, but it is honest in a way it was not before, and honest is somewhere to start. Wren is 8 months old now. She has learned to wave. Last Sunday morning, I was drinking my coffee in the armchair by the window, and she was on Owen's lap across the room, and she looked at me and waved both hands at once, this enormous uncoordinated greeting, the way babies do when they haven't yet learned to make things small. I waved back. I thought about what I nearly lost without ever understanding I was losing it. Not the house, not the property in Elora, something harder to replace than either of those things. I have been described in my life as patient. I never thought of it as a strategy. It was just how I moved through the world. But sitting in that armchair, watching my granddaughter wave at me like I was the most important person in the room, I understood that patience is not the same as passivity. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait until you have everything you need and then simply set the table. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the dinner. Not Mitchell sliding that printed email across the table. Not Colette's face when she read it. What I keep coming back to is the drive home from Beverly's office the first morning she explained what unjust enrichment meant under Ontario law, how I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could start the car. because I finally understood that what had been happening to me had a name. That was the beginning of whatever I did right. I'd been turning this over for months now, trying to understand how a person ends up in a situation like that. How someone who spent 3 decades building something honest can find himself documented, filed, and quietly outmaneuvered in his own home. The honest answer is that I let it happen slowly, not out of weakness exactly, out of a kind of misplaced generosity, the belief that if I just stayed decent, decency would eventually be returned. That's not naivety. That's something most people learn the hard way. What saved me wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to frame this as a story about getting even. It wasn't. What saved me was that I started thinking carefully when I had every reason to just react. When Colette said the word sustainable to me, when she used it to describe whether my living in my own home was viable, I could have confronted her that night. I could have called Owen from the kitchen. I could have made it loud. Instead, I made tea, sat in the dark, and started making a list of what I actually knew versus what I only suspected. That discipline, the choice to understand before you act, is something I didn't always have. It came with time, with loss, honestly. Losing Elaine taught me that most of the things we spend energy on in a day are not the things that matter, and that the ones that do matter deserve to be handled with everything you've got. I think about Owen a lot. He's not a villain in this story, and I want to be careful about how I describe what happened to him, because I've watched enough families fall apart to know that good people can drift into complicity without ever making a single conscious decision to do harm. He just kept choosing the easier thing, day after day, until the easier thing had carried him somewhere he never intended to go. That's its own kind of lesson. The character we end up with is the sum of small choices most of us barely remember making. Colette made a different set of choices, and they led to where they led. I'm not going to dress that up. She was deliberate, she planned, and still it came apart, not because fate intervened or because the universe has some automatic correction mechanism. It came apart because she had built her plan on the assumption that I wasn't paying attention. The moment I started paying attention, the whole structure had nothing to stand on. I've had a few people ask me since whether I feel badly about how the dinner went, whether I could have handled it more gently. Maybe. Bridget thinks so. But I also know that a conversation over tea would not have been enough. That without Mitchell, without Beverly, without Anita there as a witness, the same slow erosion would have continued, and I would have ended up in the basement, or worse, with no record of how I got there. Ren waved at me again this morning, both hands, same as always. Some things, if you're patient enough and honest enough and willing to do the hard thinking when it's least convenient, you get to keep.